Okay, super. Well, welcome to our Bible class for this Sunday night, the 6th of September 2020, and we're continuing our studies in the book of Ezekiel. Made excellent progress. We're up to chapter 35, the prophecy against Edom. So let's just begin by reading Ezekiel chapter 35 together. So I will just let me do that for you, and then that'll warm up my voice, and I'll be all ready to just launch straight in and carry on about that. So Ezekiel chapter 35. Moreover, the word of Yahweh came unto me, saying, Son of man, set thy face against Mount Seir, and prophesy against it, and say unto it, Thus saith the Lord Yahweh, Behold, O Seir, Mount Seir, I am against thee, and I will stretch out mine hand against thee. I will make thee most desolate. I will lay thy cities waste, and thou shalt be desolate, and thou shalt know that I am Yahweh. Because thou hast had a perpetual hatred, and hast shed the blood of the children of Israel by the force of the sword in the time of their calamity, in the time that their iniquity had an end. Therefore, as I live, says the Lord Yahweh, I will prepare thee unto blood, and blood shall pursue thee. Sith thou hast not hated blood, even blood shall pursue thee. Thus will I make Mount Seir most desolate, and cut off from him that passeth out, and him that returneth. And I will fill his mountains with his slain men, and in thy hills and in thy valleys and in all thy rivers shall they fall that are slain with the sword. I will make thee perpetual desolations, and thy cities shall not return, and ye shall know that I am Yahweh. Because thou hast said, These two nations, these two countries shall be mine, and we shall possess it, whereas Yahweh was there. Therefore, as I live, says the Lord Yahweh, I will even do according to thine anger, and according to thine envy, which thou hast used out of thine hatred against them. And I'll make myself known among them when I have judged thee. And thou shalt know that I am Yahweh, and that I have heard all thy blasphemies which thou hast spoken against the mountains of Israel, saying, They are laid waste desolate, they are given us to consume. Thus with your mouth ye have boasted against me, and have multiplied your words against me. I have heard them. Thus says the Lord Yahweh, when the whole earth rejoices, I will make thee desolate. As thou didst rejoice in the inheritance of the house of Israel, because it was desolate, so will I do unto thee. Thou shalt be desolate, O Mount Seir, and all Idumea, even all of it, and they shall know that I am Yahweh. Okay, so we have Ezekiel chapter 35 before us for our study this evening. The prophecy against Edom, against Mount Seir. So it's quite an interesting prophecy. It's obviously, as we've just read, it doesn't end well for Mount Seir, and so it's going to be one of those. It's going to be one of those classes. So I hope you're all ready for that. We have got a little bit of material to get through, so I'm just going to talk fast, and then you can slow down the recording. I think Josh can probably manage that, hopefully, with the technology. So let's have our skates on. I have got Ezekiel chapter 35, which is 15 verses, and I felt that I guess that wasn't quite enough for me. So we may just peek over the fence into Ezekiel chapter 36 as well. So Justin is giving me the evil look already, but I promise we won't lean over. We'll just have a cast our eye across the fence and look at the green pastures beyond. Okay, we also get so if you tuned in during the week to the seminar where Ron and Reese looked at some introductions and tools to looking at Bible prophecy, and they talked about the 4 ways that we know things about direct statements, about parallel passages, inferences, and hypotheses. And so we might use some or all of those tonight as we go through, and I'll let you draw your decide which is which as we go through. But we'll start out with Ezekiel 35, which is packed full of direct statements, and see where we can get to from there. So first of all, we're going to be talking about the kingdom of Edom. So we're right down the bottom in the south of this map. So we've got a rough map of the territory which we're talking about. Let's just familiarize ourselves with that. So we've got the kingdom of Judah there in the center, the Philistines on the west, Edom in the south, Moab and Ammon to the east, and then the kingdom of Damascus and Phoenician states to the north. And so this is roughly the kind of kingdom area which we're looking at the time of Ezekiel. The time that Ezekiel is writing. This is the kind of arrangement of things. Okay, and just to get a bit more detail in terms of exactly where we're looking at, this is Edom down here. If we're just focusing in, we're right down here in the south. So as you can see, we're kind of these days is kind of split between the southern part of Israel and the southern part of Transjordan. So this is it. This is the territory which we're going to be talking about in our prophecy. So let's find out before we get into the weeds of Ezekiel chapter 35 and look across the fence at the green pastures of chapter 36. We'll just familiarize ourselves again with the story of Esau and the history of Edom. Well, here we are. Everyone loves a good family tree, and we discover, in fact, that Jacob and Esau, Israel and Edom, are brothers. In fact, they're all part of the family of Abraham and Terah. So in this territory on the east and south side of the Jordan, we've got Edom, Ammon, and Moab, who are all relatives of Israel. They're all part of the family of Abraham. So this is where we start out. And of course, we know the story of Jacob and Esau, and how that Esau sold his birthright for a morsel of bread. And when it came to actually taking the birthright, that Jacob supplanted Esau, and Esau hated Jacob because of it. When it finally came to actually getting what he wanted, he actually wanted to go back on his agreement, and he hated Jacob, and he wanted to kill him. And so we know Jacob, and we know the rest of the story. Jacob fled. So here's the starting point. Obviously, with the man Jacob and the man Esau, it didn't start well. So let's just have a look. So this is a divine commentary in Hebrews, Paul in Hebrews chapter 12, talking about Esau. So this is the progenitor of the nation of Edom. Here's Esau. Here's a person who fell short of the grace of God. And Paul warns, lest there be any fornicator or profane person like Esau, who for one morsel of food sold his birthright. For you know that afterwards, when he wanted to inherit the blessing, he was rejected, for he found no place for repentance, though he sought it diligently with tears. And so we know that God brought Jacob through, who would become Israel. God brought Jacob through the journey of his life to transform him from Jacob into Israel. And yeah, Esau never made that transformation, and he stayed as the old man who hated Jacob, and a profane person who sold his birthright, placed no value on spiritual things. So this is Esau. This is the nation that we're going to talk about. So here's a brief history. Descended from Esau, as you know, lots about Esau in Genesis. You can familiarize yourself with that, as I'm sure most of you probably are. He was given Mount Seir as a possession, and there's the 12 dukes that come from Esau, listed in Genesis 36. Israel, when they came out of Egypt during the Exodus, was specifically told by God to avoid Edom. God says in fact, actually, that's in Deuteronomy chapter 2, verse 5, and also in Joshua 24. That God said to Moses, you go around them, I will not give you even a foot's breadth of their land, I've given it to them. So they were commanded by God to stay away from that, not to fight with them. They did ask to go through the land of Edom, pass through, we'll pay for water, we'll pay for passage, all of those things. And Esau came out against them came out with the sword and refused them passage. So again, we've got this incident where recorded in Numbers 20, where Edom refused with the threat of violence to give Israel safe passage, and God said, you're not to fight with them. I've given them their land. You're not going to have any of it. They fought against King Saul and were defeated by him, as recorded in 1 Samuel. They were subdued by David and garrisoned. Edom appears to be one of the bitterest conflicts of David's campaigns, and he had several that were nasty, but Edom appears to have been the bitterest one, and which resulted in him having to garrison it in order to subdue Edom. That's recorded in 2 Samuel 8. We'll come back to that a bit later. Edom did persevere though, and Hadad, at the time of King Solomon, was raised up by God, raised him up as an adversary to Solomon, as recorded in 1 Kings chapter 11. And he had a hatred for Israel. We read about Edom again at the time of Jehoshaphat, where he has a governor in Edom, and he actually goes with the king of Edom to attack Moab, as recorded in 2 Kings 3, and that's the story about, where they see the water on the side of the hill and they think that it's blood, and they all end up attacking each other. However, Edom revolts from Jehoshaphat's son, King Joram, in 2 Kings 8 successfully. However, they are defeated by King Amaziah, his son, in 2 Kings 14. But a little later on, King Ahaz is defeated by the Philistines, by the Syrians, and also by the Edomites. And the Edomites actually come and they take many captives from Judah at this time. In fact, the Edomite invasion is actually the reason why King Ahaz goes to Syria, to Damascus, to meet the king of Assyria, to say, you need to come down and help me against the Edomites. And we know, of course, that the king of Assyria came down, but he didn't help him. That's recorded in 2 Chronicles 20:28. There's a commentary about this in Amos chapter 1, where it actually talks about the hatred of Edom towards Israel, and how they slaughtered the captives, and they ripped up the women with children, and they showed no pity towards their brother Israel. And for that, God would send a fire on Edom, and that was actually the coming of the king of Assyria. So that's Amos chapter 1. And they assisted Babylon with the destruction of Jerusalem, and actually the perspective of that is recorded in Psalm 137, where the psalmist says about, remember Edom in the day of O Yahweh, in the day of our calamity said, raise it, even to the foundations thereof. That was the attitude of Edom towards Jerusalem. They wanted it utterly destroyed. Obadiah, talking about this time, said that the Edomites stood in the way of the fugitives from Babylon and butchered them when they tried to escape, and they didn't offer them safe passage or protect the fugitives from Babylon. However, that didn't save Edom from the power of Babylon, because Nebuchadnezzar, in his 23rd year, according to Josephus in his Antiquities, came and dealt with the Edomites, and he introduced, through a process of relocation. So the Babylonians practiced relocating people, just like the Assyrians did, and they relocated the Nabateans into this area, who would force the Edomites north, and they would go into southern Judah, where they would be met later on by the Maccabees, so John Hyrcanus, who would incorporate Edom into Judah with the sword. So he gave them a choice: you can convert to Judaism and become Jews, or you can die. And so some of them died, and some of them became Jews. And probably the most famous one would be Antipater, who was a steward of the last of the Maccabean rulers, who in AD 63 arranged for them to side with Rome and Pompey against Aristobulus, whose name's not there, but he was the Maccabean who was on the other side, and so Aristobulus died, and the Maccabean that Antipater supported became king. But as a reward for that and his support, and then later on his support for Octavian over Mark Antony, and of course he did switch sides because he supported Mark Antony and then switched over to Octavian. But as a reward for that, he arranged for his son Herod to be named king of Judea by Rome. And so Herod the Great, the Edomite, who was the king at the time of the birth of Jesus, the one who ordered the slaughter of the infants, is this king, King Herod the Great, the Idumean. So he finally became was over Judah, and that sent the prophecy of one of the prophecies that Isaac gave to Jacob came to pass. However, the Edomites as a people were annihilated by Rome as part of the destructions of Judea in AD 70 and AD 135 under Hadrian. And then just a couple of other things about that part of that territory. It was annexed into Rome as a province by Trajan, and Hadrian took Petra and renamed it Hadriana, of course. And then finally it was destroyed by the Muslims in the 7th century AD. Whew. Well, how about that? I hope you all managed to keep up with that. Sorry, it's a lot of information, but hopefully you got a bit of a feel for the 22 centuries of Edomite history. I know I need to catch my breath after that. That's Edomite history. Sorry, it's just brief, but that brings us to the time to gives us a bit of context just for the chapter that we're talking about, and hopefully gives us a bit of a feeling for the people of Edom and the national thinking and approach and the spirit of the nation. So here we are in Ezekiel at the time of Ezekiel 35. Prophecy against Edom. There's going to be a destruction of the nation of Edom. So here we are, Ezekiel chapter 35. Everyone loves a good breakdown. Well, hopefully you do. Here we are, the desolation of Edom. So the first few verses of chapter 35 are obviously the prophecy against Edom, the identity, who it is that God's speaking to. This is directed at Mount Seir, and it does merge a bit into chapter 36, which we're not going to talk about, but I'm just saying that it does. And you've got these contrast of two mountains. You've got in chapter 35, you've got Mount Seir, and it's going to be opposed to the mountains of Israel. So if we just go back here, you can't really see them, but the mountains of Israel is what we today call the West Bank. There you go, got a pointer. And if we go back, sorry, can I do this? We've got a pen. So the mountains of Israel is this kind of area through here. Probably actually comes down a bit. How about that? That's the mountains of Israel. So that's the place that we're talking. Contrast between the Mount Seir and the mountains of Israel. It's introduced for us here, and so chapter 35 we've got the prophecy against Mount Seir, and then in chapter 36 you've got God speaking to the mountains of Israel about some of these things. So then there's a reason of verse 5 to 13, the reasons for the coming judgment, and then the final desolation of Edom is predicted, and then Edom and the nations round about are devastated, and then Israel is restored. And actually, one of the key words that comes up in this section is the word desolate. Actually, there's about 3 different words in here for desolate, and they mean obviously desolate, a ruin, a void, And the main word is desolate in the terms of being made dry. So it's dry, it's dried and withered up. And that part of the world now today is renowned for its dryness. It's a dry and withered part of the world, and that's what God said would happen to Edom, and in fact, it has. It's been dried up and withered. It's a desolate ruin and a desolate place. And so, if we have a look at what's at the spirit of Edom as described in this prophecy, we find that this is why the judgment is going to come. But Edom has an everlasting hatred of Israel. It loves violence. They were greedy for ill-gotten gain. They were envious and angry at Israel. They spoke blasphemy. They slandered Israel. They slandered God. They were arrogant. They spoke out against God, and they rejoiced at Israel's calamity. I just want us to pay attention to a couple of these things that illustrate the spirit of the Edomite. We see in verse 5 that says he had an everlasting hatred, and verse 5 says, but this is the reason why the judgment is coming upon Edom. It says, because you have a perpetual hatred and shed the blood of the children of Israel. That word perpetual is, it's the Hebrew word olam. It means has the idea of hidden, that is so far in the distance. It's beyond sight. It's in the distance, and in this case it means from the distant past. Like you've had this hatred for Israel forever from the olam, but it's contrasted, or it's paired up with the destruction of Edom in verse 9, where you've got the same word in verse 9, I will make thee perpetual desolation. So you've got this hatred of Israel from the olam, from everlasting, from beyond memory. But I'm going to make you a desolation forever, for the future. It comes up again in chapter 36, but we won't go there because that's chapter 36. But there's an appropriateness about a pairing of these ideas, the forever, and also then again for the violence. They loved violence, so it says that they shed blood with the force of the sword. And so God says in verse 6, I've prepared you for blood because you didn't hate blood. Blood will pursue these. So God, again, there's a pairing of these ideas. God has, there's an appropriateness about what's going to happen to Edom because of what they did. So they shed the blood of the children of Israel. God says your blood is going to be shed. Your blood's going to be pursued. You forced the children of Israel with the sword. You killed them, and in the time of their calamity, verse 8, I will fill your mountains with slain men, your hills and your valleys and your rivers, all slain with the sword. You took them with the sword. I will send the sword, verse 8, after you. So there's a pairing all the way through. There's a pairing of these ideas, and actually you find this it's the same in Amos chapter 1. It's the same in the prophecy about Edom in Obadiah. There's very much a matching of Edom's behavior and attitudes with the judgment that they are going to receive. And this is very much, as we know, the way that God operates. In fact, in the law of Moses, we know that the penalty for those who are caught with making a false accusation, the false witness, the penalty for the false witness is that they would have done to them what it was that they imagined to do to their brother. So So they would receive that consequence. That would be the consequence of the false witness. And we find that there's an appropriateness about that. You wanted it to do it to them and you witness falsely. So that's going to be your consequence. And so here, where you've got this spirit of hatred with Edom against his brother Israel, that God says that these are all the things that you wanted to do and actually did to Israel. Well, I'm going to bring them back on your own head and you're going to receive them. Now, Edom were greedy for this ill-gotten gain. So, of course, at the time of Ezekiel, Edom was actually a confederate with Judah. The king of Edom was confederate with Zedekiah to rebel against the king of Babylon. But when it came down to it, and the king of Babylon was winning, Edom switched sides and changed and went with Babylon and were forward in the destruction of Jerusalem. They were there to divide the spoil. They were saying, raise it even to the foundations. And they caught the fugitives and killed them. And part of their motivation was, in addition to their hatred of Israel and their love of violence, was their greed for ill-gotten gain. Because it says in verse 10 verse 10 and 11, it says, because you've said these two nations, these two countries shall be mine, and we shall possess it. So they desired to take advantage of and possess the now vacant land of Judah. So we know, of course, that God said about Judah that he would cast them out because of their sins and the land would enjoy their Sabbaths. And Edom said, that's fine. We'll have it. It's for us. And God says, well, what you've not calculated, what you've left out of all your schemes is that I was there. The land wasn't empty. God was still there. And God said, it's not for you to have. And they were greedy for ill-gotten gains. They were out for themselves, and they were willing to take advantage of their brother in order to do that. And that ensured the doom of Edom, which you can go to there today, and I believe you find that it is a desolate place. So the consequence is what God said: it will be made completely desolate. The cities are to be overthrown. So it's one of our words, to be thrown down. It's to be destroyed with violence and bloodshed. It will never be restored, ever. And it will be made desolate when the whole earth rejoices. So this is it. This is the end of Edom as prophesied. Completely desolate, cities overthrown, destroyed with violence and bloodshed, never to be restored, and made desolate when all the earth rejoices. We don't know, of course, that it's a fact of history that Nebuchadnezzar came and destroyed Edom, and the Romans came and finished it off. They annihilated Edom. After AD 135, or really AD 70, but anything that was left was finished by 135, there was no Edom left. It was gone. Which raises the question, of course, isn't this section of Ezekiel about the restoration prophecies? About the time when Israel is going to be restored? About the preparation for the kingdom age? So why in the middle of the restoration prophecies would we have a chapter about the destruction of Edom, which happened 2,000 years ago? Or is there a latter-day Edom? And if so, what is it? Who is it? And or where is it? So to answer this question, we maybe should step back and have a bit of a look at the context, just remind ourselves, here we are in Ezekiel. So I know we've probably familiar with this. I think we've looked at this in just about every class sort of thing in just about every class, but Ezekiel's really divided into two parts. The first part, which is from the captivity up to the destruction of Jerusalem, starts with Ezekiel being his call and commission as a watchman. There's prophecies against Judah and Jerusalem, and then there's prophecies against the nations. And we look through all those sections, and it's about the judgment that's coming on Jerusalem, the judgment on the nations. And then there's a second section of Ezekiel, chapter 33 to 48, which is after the destruction of Jerusalem. It begins with Ezekiel being recommissioned as a watchman. And then we've got chapters 34 to 39, the rest, which we call the restoration prophecies, about how Israel's going to be restored. And we had last class, we had Brother Robert talk about the one shepherd and his flock, about how that God's going to regather the flock and sort out the shepherds and the sheep and the goats and sort all those things out. And then we've got the temple vision of chapter 40 through to 48. And if we zero in on the restoration prophecies, we've got these ones which we've talked about. Chapter 33, the watchman. Chapter 34, the shepherd and his flock. Chapter 35, part of 36, the desolation of Edom. The restoration of the mountains of Israel. In chapter 37, we've got the well-known vision of the valley of dry bones, the resurrection, the physical and spiritual resurrection of the nation of Israel. The parable of the two sticks, the unification of the nation of Israel, one nation and one king on the mountains of Israel, the covenant of peace and the building of the temple. And then we've got chapter 38, the destruction, and 39, the destruction of Gog and his allies, and chapter 39, the glory of God among the nations. So just from the context of the restoration prophecies in this section, we know that there's a whole story being told us here about the restoration of Israel, and part of that story is the desolation of Edom. It's an important part of this story about how God is going to restore Israel, and the restoration of Israel includes the desolation of Edom. So, what are our choices? Well, it actually turns out that there's not really been too many options for the restoration prophecies to be fulfilled. There might be 4 and 5. Maybe Justin, you might tell me if I've missed something, but there was the return that was led by Zerubbabel, so that's Ezra and Nehemiah, the return under during the Persian Empire, which lasted through until AD 135 and the destruction by Rome. And then there's the more recent return, which was initiated by Theodor Herzl and then led through the 20th century, finally with David Ben-Gurion, and the establishment of the State of Israel, which is the situation we see today. And then there's thirdly, there's the time of the end, the kingdom of Messiah. These are really our three options in terms of the time periods that we can look at for the fulfillment of the restoration prophecies of Ezekiel. And we know, of course, that that there was an initial restoration of Israel led by Zerubbabel, and as Ezekiel and Jeremiah both said there would be. And yet we know that the restoration under Zerubbabel and Nehemiah and those governors, even though there was a rebuilding of the temple, it didn't really fit the terms of the restoration prophecies of Ezekiel. They didn't end up with a David being king. They built a temple, but there wasn't an everlasting covenant of peace. It turned out that the shepherds weren't really good shepherds and ended as a desolation and a destruction and judgment in the flames of AD 70 and the burning of the temple. And we see that, and we know, of course, that the return, as led by Theodore Herzl and others through to the re-establishment of the state of Israel, has not led to a King David, or a covenant of peace, or a rebuilding of the temple, or a spiritual rebirth of Israel, which leads us to our third time, the future restoration of Israel as a kingdom under Messiah. Of course, it's probably not overly surprising, because it turns out that there's actually a number of latter-day Edom prophecies. Here they are. I could have sort of phased them in for you, but I didn't. You can just have them as a big dump. Here they are. So here's a bunch of latter-day Edom prophecies. Here, so you've got Numbers 24, the star shall come out of Jacob and do a few things. And one of the things that the star that will come out of Jacob, that's the verse where it says, I see him, but not yet. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob, and he'll destroy the sons of pride. And one of the things that he will do is he will possess Edom. And of course, you could say, well, this is a prophecy about King David, who did do those things. But perhaps the greater than David is Messiah, who would come and will do that. Edom actually pops up in Isaiah chapter 11. So we're not going to turn to all of these passages, because I know I'm going to be trespassing on your time, even just as it is. But I'm sure you're familiar with a number of these prophecies. Isaiah chapter 11. So this is the nations that go up to Jerusalem. This is our well-known kingdom prophecy in the age of Messiah. Israel will subdue Edom, Moab, and Ammon in that time. The time of an Edom of some description at that time. Isaiah chapter 34, linked with Isaiah chapter 35, that Yahweh has a sacrifice in Bozrah. It's a chapter about the destruction of Edom. And you'll probably find, I'm not sure actually, is Ron online? Anyway, I'm sure Ron will give you will probably in one of his talks about Hezekiah and the virus. I'm sure he will talk about Isaiah 35 and 36 and how there's an application there in the time of Hezekiah, which is very interesting. But it talks about the destruction of Edom at that time, and there's appears to be a latter day application for Isaiah 34, as well as 35. Isaiah chapter 36, there's the prophecy of the one who comes from Edom. So he comes from Bozrah with garments, dipped in blood. This is a messianic prophecy, a prophecy of Messiah who will come through Edom on his way to Jerusalem. In Habakkuk, again, this is another prophecy about that time, that God will come from Teman. So Teman's another word, another name, another location within Edom. So Edom, Teman, Bozrah, Petra, Mount Seir, all places in Edom. Daniel chapter 11, verse 41, talking about the time where the king of the north comes down. It talks about that these shall escape out of his hand, even Edom and Moab and the chief of the children of Ammon. So if Daniel 11 is talking about the same time period of Ezekiel 38, then there is an Edom there at that time. Joel chapter 3. So Joel chapter 3. This is the end of Joel chapter 3, which a latter day prophecy, where it talks about Edom being a desolation. Actually, Edom and the nations round about will be a desolation. And then we've got Ezekiel chapter 35 in the latter day prophecies. And actually, one thing I didn't put in here was Obadiah. The whole book of Obadiah, which is one chapter, is a book solely about the destruction and desolation of the nation of Edom. So there is to be a latter-day Edom. Before we get to that slide. So, but maybe, I suppose, a good question to ask now is, why should we have a prophecy about Edom in the middle of the restoration prophecies? Well, that is an excellent question. So I'm glad I asked. So just hold on to that thought. And part of it is to do with the spirit of Edom. So we've probably talked about I've probably talked about a couple of these things, but I'd just like to bring your attention to them, because we might look, go, well, Edom's already desolate. There already is no Edom. It's gone. Well, so we looked earlier at the spirit of Edom, about their ancient hatred. They've had a hatred from time beyond memory. Well, here we are. This is about the Assyrian invasion. This is what Amos says in Amos chapter 1, about that Edom pursued his brother with the sword. He would not take pity. In fact, I'll just read that section of Amos for you, because it's quite instructive, actually. So this is Edom of generations before. But in Amos chapter 1, it says that this is a series of prophecies against the surrounding nations. Here they are, Amos chapter 1 and verse 11. Thus saith Yahweh, for 3 transgressions of Edom and for 4, I will not turn away the punishment thereof, because he did pursue his brother with the sword, and did cast off all pity, and his anger did tear perpetually, that is forever, and he kept his wrath forever. But I will send a fire on Teman, which shall devour the palaces of Bozrah. So this fire was going to be the Assyrian, who would come down and would consume them, which the Assyrians did. And but at the time of Amos, it points out that Edom pursued their brother with the sword. They took no pity, but their anger was perpetual, everlasting. They had this everlasting anger, and they forgot the brotherly covenant. They hated their brother Israel. And then we've got the story of the Babylonians. So that's generations before. So now we've got the story of the Babylonian invasion. There's an interesting passage in Jeremiah 27 where the kings of Edom and Ammon and Moab and Tyre and Zidon, they send all their ambassadors to Jerusalem to meet with Zedekiah to plan, because they've all rebelled against the king of Babylon, and they're going to plan their defense and take part in all this. And Jeremiah says to them, you need to go back to your kings and say, you need to serve Babylon. Put your neck under the yoke of Babylon, because God has given him dominion. You fight against him, you'll fail. But interestingly, at this time of Jeremiah 27, with Zedekiah, Edom is confederate with Judah in their rebellion against Babylon. And yet, shortly later, Edom will have changed sides. They will be vicious in attacking Judah. They'll be active in dividing the spoils. In fact, if we just come to Obadiah, we'll see that Obadiah says that explicitly. So just over a few pages from Amos. In verse 10, for thy violence against thy brother Jacob, shame shall cover thee, thou shalt be cut off forever. In the day that thou stoodest on the other side, in the day that the strangers carried away captive his, that is Jacob's forces, and foreigners entered into his gates and cast lots upon Jerusalem, even you were as one of them. But thou shouldst not have looked on the day of thy brother, in the day that he became a stranger, neither shouldst thou have rejoiced over the children of Judah in the day of their destruction, neither shouldst thou have spoken proudly in the day of distress. Thou shouldst not have entered into the gate of my people in the day of their calamity. Yea, thou shouldst not have looked on their affliction in the day of their calamity, or laid hands on their substance in the day of their calamity. Neither shouldest thou have stood in the crossway to cut off those of his that did escape. Neither shouldest thou have delivered up those of his that did remain in the day of distress. For the day of Yahweh is near upon all the heathen. As thou hast done, it shall be done unto thee. Thy reward shall return upon thine own head. For as ye have drunk upon my holy mountain, so shall all the heathen drink continually. Yea, they shall drink, and they shall swallow down, and they shall be as though they had not been. So God describes here through Obadiah what it was, the behavior and attitude of Edom towards his brother, where just a few months earlier they had been confederate with Judah. They behaved treacherously, and then not only that, but they were active in dividing the spoil, in jeering and speaking proudly over their brother, in looking on their and laying hands on their substance in the day of their calamities, in preventing people from escaping, handing them over to the Babylonians. All the things God said they should not do. They didn't care for their brother. Their anger tore continually. And interestingly, it says there, God says about Edom, as you have done, so your reward will be. There's an appropriateness about this. God says, you did this, that's what's going to happen to you. It will return upon your own head. This is the spirit of Edom, as we see here in Obadiah, in Amos, and then also in Ezekiel chapter 35. It's not just Edom. So Edom is associated, and this perhaps in terms of well, what are we looking at for Edom in terms of what would we expect for a future Edom? Well, there's also a phrase that goes with Edom in Ezekiel chapter 36. It talks about all Idumea, and this is where we're just going to cast our eye across the fence and look at the green grass over there. There's an interesting phrase in verse 5 of chapter 36, verse 4 and 5. It talks about the residue of the nations that are round about. So chapter 36, verse 4, the end of verse 4, the residue of the nations that are round about. Jerusalem became a prey for them. Verse 5, the residue of the nation. I've spoken against the residue of the nations and against all Idumea, or all Edom. That's verse 5. And then end of verse 6, shame on all the nations. It's actually that reference should actually be Ezekiel 36 verse 7. The nations that are about you, round about. And this phrase, the nations, is a Gentile, the goy, the Gentiles around about, nations round about. And the word round about, of course, means surrounded or to encircle. Used for lots of different things, but this phrase comes up, I think, 47 times in the Old Testament. Here's a selection of them. And it talks about those nations around about Jerusalem, which is around about Judah, which you can see these nations here are the nations that encircle Judah and Israel. They're spoken of that way, about the people that were afflicting and causing trouble in the time of Nehemiah. They're those nations that surrounded Judah and Jerusalem. Interestingly in Jeremiah 25, we'll come there in a moment, and it's there in the early parts of Ezekiel, the nations round about, specifically these nations. Here in Ezekiel 36, the nations round about, including Edom. It's a phrase that comes up in Joel chapter 3, so we've already mentioned Joel chapter 3 in terms of a latter-day Edom. Joel chapter 3, the nations that are round about, and comes up in Zechariah 14, another latter-day prophecy. Let's just cast our eyes over Jeremiah 25. I can't actually quite see the time, so I'm just going to pretend that I've got heaps left. Don't see it. So, like I said, I'm just going to pretend I've got heaps left. So in Jeremiah 25, when it talks about the the surrounding nations. Jeremiah 25 and verse 9, it says, thus saith the Lord of hosts, because you have not heard my words, behold, I will send and take all the families of the north, saith Yahweh, and Nebuchadnezzar king of Babylon, my servant, will bring them against this land and against the inhabitants thereof, and against all these nations round about, and will utterly destroy them, and make them an astonishment and a hissing and a perpetual desolation. And goes on to talk about all those nations that were round about. And it's talking about how God would bring Nebuchadnezzar in to, and he would destroy these Judah, bring his judgment on Judah and the nations around about them. We're talking about the immediate nations around, neighbors around Israel. So how do we identify latter-day nations in prophecy? Here's an interesting thing. We use these, I've got three of them. So here they are. They might be the literal descendants of those nations. So of course, we've obviously the nation of Israel is one of these. They are the literal descendants of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. We use this. We also look at the territories, what's the location at the time of the prophet, and then we might look for the latter day, who occupies or who may occupy that territory at the time of the end. Or we look at the characteristics of those people. So we look quite a bit at the characteristics of Edom. We look at the characteristics, the people who manifest the characteristics of that nation as described in the prophecy. And of course, we know that we use this for a number of in a number of ways as well. In fact, actually, that's part of becoming, the Gentiles becoming part of Israel is about this manifesting the character of Abraham and becoming part of that. So, which is it for Edom? Well, I suppose this is where we get into the territory of hypothesis for this one. So I'm proposing that my proposition, my hypothesis, I suppose, is that we're looking at this territory here. We've got our southern part here, and whether these Arabs who surround Israel follow the pattern as Edom in the time of Babylon, who were confederate with Judah, just as Transjordan is confederate with Israel. But at the time of the invasion by Gog, as described in Ezekiel 38, they escape out of Gog's hand and change sides and become engaged in that, and follow the pattern set out by Edom of old. And we know that that in the many of the Arab nations around Israel, there is a spirit of hatred for Israel among those surrounding nations, and we know that Messiah is going to come through, and we know he's going to come through that territory on his way to save Israel and Judah. So, and one of the interesting things I think about that, so I think I asked, so I think I know because I asked it, is why we have the prophecy of Edom in Ezekiel chapter 35 and the restoration prophecies. And I believe it's because of this, that in order for the kingdom of God and for Israel to dwell safely and to be restored and to be prosperous and secure under the reign of Messiah, the nations around it who hate Israel must be subdued and the hatred destroyed. So the spirit of Edom must be destroyed in order for Israel to be restored. And if you think about it, then the designation of David being the king is a clue in terms of this, because what did David do? So we know, of course, that Robert talked about David being the king in the promised king in chapter 34. It comes up again in chapter 37. And the identity of the David of Ezekiel's prophecy is a whole study all on its own. But if we look back at King David, what he did is, after bringing the ark to Zion, is he went round his campaigns, he subdued and destroyed and subjected the surrounding nations who hated Israel, many of whom hated Israel, not all of them, but a number of them, and subdued them, which enabled the security and peace and prosperity and the building of the temple under Solomon. Because of those campaigns of David that he'd established, and he'd subdued the nations that were round about. And it appears from Psalm 60 and those dimensions of Edom in 1 Kings 11 and 2 Samuel 8, that the campaign in Edom was the bitterest of the campaigns of David. You know, if you're making notes, the reading of Psalm 60 is quite instructive about that. That at that time David felt that God had abandoned them in their campaign in Edom, but in the end God did bring them to victory. But it felt like they had been abandoned and that they wouldn't be successful. It's quite interesting reading, but it appears to be that it was the bitterest of David's campaigns. But the subjection of these nations enabled the prosperity and security and peace of the reign of Solomon, which we know is a pattern of the kingdom of Messiah, the greater than Solomon, who will come. And so we have this interesting quote in Ezekiel chapter 28. So this is at the end of the section of the nations that were immediately around to the east and west of the nations that surrounded Jerusalem, because beyond that's going to be the prophecy against Egypt, where it says that there shall be no more a pricking briar to the house of Israel, nor any grieving thorn of all them that are round about them that despise them. And they shall know that I am the Lord Yahweh. Thus saith the Lord Yahweh, when I shall have gathered the house of Israel from the people among whom they're scattered, and shall be sanctified in them in the sight of the nations, and they shall dwell in their land that I have given to my servant Jacob. It describes that future time. And the nation of Edom encapsulated the pricking briar of those nations round about because of their perpetual hatred, their ancient hatred from beyond memory. They are an example, a pattern of the pricking briar against Israel. And God says that spirit of Edom, the pricking briar, that hatred is going to be destroyed to enable the restoration of Israel as described in the prophets. So this is what Peter says in Acts chapter 3. It's an interesting quote, where he talks about the preaching to repent and be converted, that your sins may be blotted out when the time of refreshing comes from the presence of the Lord. And he shall send Jesus Christ, which before was preached unto you, whom heaven must receive until the time of restitution of all things, which God has spoken by the mouth of all his holy prophets since the world began. And the restoration prophecies of Ezekiel are some of the most explicit examples of the times of restitution of all things, which Peter speaks about. This section in Ezekiel is one of the clearest, most direct sections about it. About this time. So I hope you found that interesting. I think we've gone. I know we've raced through like a heap of history and a whole bunch of prophecies, not just Ezekiel 35, and we've really raced through lots of things. So I'm sure you've got plenty of questions, and I'm sure you'll have some thoughts about those four things that we looked at in prophecy: the direct statements, some parallel passages, some inferences, and some hypotheses. So I hope you found that interesting and informative, and I'm sure there'll be plenty of discussion to be had. That brings me to the end of my comments on the prophecy of Ezekiel chapter 35. here's a bunch of interesting reading. So if you're looking for further things, I'm sure there's lots of other actual books that you could find on the restoration prophecies of Ezekiel. But here's a bunch of the ones, the main ones that I found, which were interesting and useful. So you might find them interesting and useful as well. And if you've got some others that that you think, then let me know, because I'm always looking for. I'm interested in more in other sources as well. So with that, I'll conclude. We can finish the thing and open up for some questions.